Hello, friends and neighbors. Let's talk about doing your duty makes a difference.
Welcome to A Word for Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us. Each Wednesday you will find Boggs Family Ministries is here with our host, Davy Boggs. Having you along with us is a wonderful addition. Now, let's enjoy together A Word for Wednesday.
Thank you, Brother Devin, and thank you for joining us today on A Word for Wednesday. Talking today about doing your duty makes a difference. I think we all sometimes do things because it's the right thing to do. It's the thing we should do, and that applies to every area of life. I worked for several years in construction and in a factory environment, and there were a lot of days I followed through with my job because it was my job. Oftentimes, I found myself doing things because it needed to be done. I saw something that needed to be done, and I did it. But a lot of times, I was doing what I was doing because that's what I had been assigned to do. You nail this here. You put this part on here. You apply this emblem here. You weigh and balance this tire here. This is your duty. And so for 10 or 12 hours a day, we do our duty. And many of you do that in your jobs every single day. You wait tables because it's your duty. You figure out the code for that program because it's your duty. You balance the books, you do the experiment, you build the house, you do all the things you do because it is your duty. Sometimes you don't feel like doing it. It's not the optimal thing for you at the moment. Maybe you would rather be on a boat drowning a worm in the lake. Maybe you would rather be in the woods hunting. Maybe you would rather be somewhere shopping, looking for a new dress, looking for a new suit. Maybe you'd like to be out driving with the windows down and the wind in your hair or the wind on your face. But you got to do your duty. And sometimes, even spiritually, we do what we do because it's what we're supposed to do. And we feel guilty about that sometimes. I'm just at church tonight because it's my duty. I'm singing tonight because it's my duty. I'm worshiping tonight because it's my duty. No, that's not the best reason to do it. But even doing your duty makes a difference. That's why duty should be done from our heart. This is what I'm commanded to do. This is what I have been assigned to do. And doing it half-heartedly is not really doing it, because we've got to put our heart into it for it to be really effective. But even if you're just doing it because it's your duty, it can make a great difference in someone else's life. Many years ago, Dr. Henry Ward Beecher, he was a pastor of a city church. He had a prearranged schedule to exchange pulpits with a country preacher. The country preacher would journey to the city, preaching Dr. Beecher's pulpit that Sunday morning. He would travel out to the country and preach in the country preacher's pulpit that morning. It used to be a fairly common practice many years ago, and there was a lot of benefit to it. The people were able to hear a different voice. The preacher was blessed to preach at a different congregation, and so it was a win all the way around. I imagine there were less itinerant preachers going from place to place, so the pastors exchanging pulpits was a blessing to them, and it was a blessing to the congregations. It just so happened that on this prearranged day, there was a winter storm, and so Dr. Beecher made his way to the country on his horse, trudging through the drifts. He made it to the church. He didn't even know if the church would be open. There was no way to communicate. There were no telephones, nobody to tell him, oh, we're not having church. And so he was surprised when he saw that there were lamps lit inside and it was bright inside. He stalled his horse there in the place where they had for horses, but there were no other horses there, no buggies there, no evidence that anybody had been in the church except one set of footprints. Evidently, the sexton had been there and lit the lamps and built a fire and put wood in the stove that would last through the service. And then he had exited and went home, probably thinking, no one will come. I will come back later, put out the fire, and put out the lamps. But Henry Ward Beecher did his duty. He took his outer coat off, hung it up, his hat, his boots, put on his shoes, went up to the pulpit, and sat on the platform, waiting to see if anyone would come. Right as church time approached, or maybe a couple of minutes late, a man came in the back door, looked around, saw that he was the only one in attendance, turned around, but he didn't walk out the door. He sat in the very back pew and waited. Dr. Beecher debated, should I preach or should I not? What would the pastor, who's now in my pulpit, expect me to do? What would the deacons who couldn't make it this morning, what would they expect me to do? And Dr. Beecher decided they would expect me to do my duty. They have called me here to preach. That is my duty. I want to tell you, from many decades of preaching, it is a whole lot more fun to preach to a crowd than it is to preach to one. I've preached to a lot of empty pews in my time, never got one of them to come forward for salvation. And if I did get them saved, how could you ever baptize a whole pew? I think we would have to resort to sprinkling in that case, but they've never responded. And when you preach to empty pews, that can be very disheartening. But Dr. Beecher said, I will do my duty. So he arose and he preached like the house was full. And he was a notable preacher. He bowed his head at the end of the sermon and prayed the benediction over the sermon and over the service. When he raised his head and opened his eyes, he caught a glimpse of his one person in attendance, putting the hat on, his coat was already on, and he slipped out the door. Dr. Beecher made his way to the door, but by the time he got outside, the storm had swallowed up his one person in attendance. Had no idea who he was. Chalked the whole thing up to experience, did his duty. He went to get his horse, put all his overcoat and his boots and his hat on, got on his horse, went into the storm, back to the city, back home, basically forgot the whole situation. Years later, he was visiting a small village in the state of Ohio, and a man approached him and called him by name, Dr. Beecher, which was not terribly uncommon. He was kind of a well-known preacher, but here he was in a small village. Nobody there should know him. And he said, I'm sorry, sir, you have the advantage of me. I do not know you, do I? And he said, well, I wouldn't expect you to know me, but we did spend an hour or two alone in a building in a storm one day. And Dr. Beecher was kind of taken aback, and he said, I do not recall. When did this happen? He said, do you remember 20 years ago preaching in such and such a place out in the country at this church, and you preached to one man? And Dr. Beecher lit up, and he said, oh, yes, I remember. And if you are that man, I have often wondered who you were. He said, who I was not of importance. What you said was of great importance. From that sermon, I was saved. And from that sermon, I was compelled to become a preacher of the gospel. Yonder, in this village, is the church that I currently pastor. And Dr. Beecher, the converts, the people who have been saved as a result of that sermon on that snowy day are all over the state of Ohio. Wow. Doing your duty really makes a difference. I don't really feel like doing it, Brother Davy. I'm just not at my best. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, though. I'm going to do my duty. Sing that song, brother. Play that piano, sister. Preach that message, son. It may seem like it falls on deaf ears, but stand up and do your duty and watch God make the difference. What you and I do doesn't make much of a difference, but when God gets involved, what a difference it makes. It has happened several times recently, and I have been blessed by it. When someone approaches me and says, similar to that man, to Dr. Beecher, Brother Davy, I know you don't remember it, but it was in a tent revival. You preached such and such, or you sang this. It was down at so-and-so's church or in this town. And I came to the altar and I got saved. And I've been saved ever since. Hallelujah. What a blessing. Oh, some of those nights I was a nervous wreck. Some of those nights I was sick and I needed to be in the bus, not under the tent. Some of those nights I was burdened down with cares of the road and of family and of life. And I wondered if I could preach it all, but I stood and committed to doing my duty, and someone got saved. Doing your duty makes a world of difference. Let me encourage you, child of God. You say, I'm not a preacher, I'm not a singer. I don't know what you're talking about, Brother Davy. All of us have a duty. Let me encourage you, do it in spite of how you feel, and see if God doesn't make up the difference. God will take up the slack, make the difference, and make something profitable out of your duty. And that is my word for Wednesday. And maybe that will make a difference. Thank you, friends. I commit to doing my best to seeing you next week.
That is our word for Wednesday. We are so glad that you've spent a few minutes with us today. If you've been touched by today's episode, please share it with your friends and family. We welcome your questions or comments below or by email. You can find the email address in the description, along with a link to Mile Markers, the website for Boggs Family Ministries. Also, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Thank you again, and we hope to see you next Wednesday.
Ciao for now.